the gift of suffering. Last time we talked about how suffering is very useful from a spiritual growth point of view. The reason being that suffering is one of the chief ways that the spirit, our own inner being, our true self, which some people call God, but it is not some outer God that lives in some sky out there. Rather, it's the indwelling spirit. And suffering is the way, the chief way, that our spirit helps us to weaken the grip the ego has on our body. The ego likes to think it is in control and will co-opt any spiritual teachings. Suffering is the way through which the ego realizes that it is not in control, and indeed never has been in control. And the fact of the matter is, the ego is the only one that doesn't like suffering. Our spirit, our being, it cannot suffer because it is beyond the duality of good and bad, sadness and happiness, joy and pain. It is beyond all dualities, but not the ego. The ego, in fact, loves dualities. It loves light and dark, good and bad, night and day. It loves them because it gives it a reason to exist. It always finds a reason to fight, a reason to take sides. My country versus yours, my tribe versus yours. I am good versus you are bad. My people are holier than yours, or my people are more scientific than yours. We are more advanced than you. The ego will always find something to fight for. And to fight, there has to be two sides. Because it would be very stupid fighting yourself. Unless you are Ed Norton in Fight Club. But that's a different story. Ego needs duality. It needs good and bad. It needs something to fight for. And the ego has its own definition of what is good and what is bad. And suffering from the ego's point of view is usually not suffering in itself. What the ego considers suffering may just be its arrogant desires not being met. The ego wants the whole world to dance to its tune, to get whatever it wants, whenever it wants. And if it can't, it'll blame God. What sort of a God wouldn't let me have what I want, says the ego. God must be false. Either that, or the ego makes up a God whose only job is to fulfill the desires of the ego. If you look at any or most descriptions of God, most people pray to God to get something or when they want something. And this God has been created by the ego itself to justify itself. There's a God out there, says the ego, whose only function is to serve me, to give me everything I want, I desire. And if God can't do that, it's not really a God. The funny thing is, the ego isn't even that scared of death. I know many people are scared of death, but the ego isn't. The ego would rather die if its desires couldn't be fulfilled, or it can die to become bigger. Look at all these people dying for their country or for their religion, going to their death or blowing themselves up for some heaven in an afterlife they've never seen. That's the ego becoming big by death. In other cases, if the ego feels it cannot get what it wants, it would rather die. And suicide is a good example of this. Many people who commit suicide, some might have genuinely huge problems, but many others are just depressed in the moment. They lost their job, or they lost their boyfriend or girlfriend, and they lose all perspective on life. The ego feels it's better to die than to live in humiliation. So the ego isn't really scared of death. Death has a disgust for it, but it's not really scared of it. What it is scared of is, however, is not getting what it wants and suffering as a result of it. And so, of course, our spirit uses suffering as a tool, as a learning device, to teach the ego that it is not in control of life, that it cannot get whatever it wants, whenever it wants, without any consequences or without any limit. The funny thing is, in the spirit, in being, we can get anything we want, because the spirit is by definition unlimited and infinite. The spirit desires nothing, it needs nothing, but it can have anything. And that's the paradox of spirit. The ego wants to reach that state in which it can get anything it desires, just like the spirit. But it is not willing to make the sacrifice to give up its current holding on to life. In a way, the ego wants what's called the chocolate cake diet. The chocolate cake diet is in which you eat as many chocolate cakes as you want and you still lose weight. And that's what the ego wants. The whole world, the whole universe should run by its rules. It should never have to suffer, and it should never have to give up anything to get what it wants. And everything should not only come to it, but come to it now, immediately, right now, right this second. The ego hates waiting. Why, if it is so special, should it wait for anything? Hence, the spirit must use suffering to control the ego. In suffering, once we suffer, do we realize that there is something much bigger than us that controls our life and destiny, and that we are like leaves on a river, being taken along for a ride. It doesn't matter if we fight the river or we cooperate with the river. The river doesn't care. It'll still take us where we need to go, rather where the river is going. In this case, the river is the combined consciousness of all humanity and everything, all creatures, from animals to plants to trees. We all have a collective destiny as to where we are going. Don't ask me, because I don't know. I am as unenlightened as you are, or I am as enlightened as you are. So spirit must use suffering to let the ego know that it is not in control. The more the ego fights, the more it suffers. At one point, you have to surrender to the totality of the universe. Surrender doesn't mean becoming passive or lazy. Surrender means we continue doing the work in the world, the karma yoga of the Gita, but without expecting or without desiring the results. On a more practical level, surrender can also mean that we accept the decisions that the universe makes for us, that we don't overthink everything. The problem is that we overthink every single thing in our life, and that's the ego's way of controlling us. Thinking. Thinking is needed, obviously. It serves a purpose, but it's a tool to be used at certain times and then let go of. In our case, the tool has taken over of life, and we have become slaves of the tool. We must do what the mind tells us. We must continuously be thinking, analyzing. And all this thinking and analyzing is a way that the ego remains in control. It is always trying to think itself out of every problem. Sometimes you can think yourself out of a problem, but sometimes you can only think so much. You just have to surrender or accept that there are some things out of your control, that you may not be able to control every single point of life, but that still there is something bigger than you. Something that knows what to do, that knows what the best decision or the best choice for you is. As the Course in Miracles says, whenever you have a problem, at that a very exact moment, the universe, the spirit, also creates a solution for it. But our problem is that we are so stuck in our own minds that we do not listen to the solution the universe is giving us, and rather we try to fight the universe, to force our own will on the universe. And this, of course, leads to suffering. Rather than choosing the path of least resistance, we choose the path that would make the ego the biggest. And that's the story of suffering. That's the reason we need suffering to grow spiritually. People who do not have suffering in their life, they may not be sad, but neither will they grow spiritually. And there's nothing wrong with that. There's no law that says that we all have to become spiritual. But if your own spirit, your own being, not some God outside sitting on a throne in heaven, but your own spirit has decided that you need to grow by suffering. They don't fight suffering. Don't go looking for it, but don't fight it either. Accept it when it comes and try to learn what lesson it has for you. For every suffering has a lesson. I cannot tell you what your lesson is because it will be highly tailored for you. 3 people in the same family who live in the same house, eat the same food, and have the same problem, the same sort of suffering, might learn 3 different lessons from it. Some might not choose to learn at all, and some might choose the lesson of the ego, and the ego loves to blame. It's the fault of the world, it's the fault of God, it's the fault of other people. That's fine. That's how the ego works. If you choose a path of the ego, then remember, you will get more suffering. Because that's what surrendering to the ego means and leads to. More suffering. So don't run from suffering, but rather embrace it and see what lessons it teaches you. Because remember, it's your own spirit, your own being that has brought this suffering upon you. Not some God out there, not some karma. People blame their karma for the previous life. Again, it's a form of blaming. You're blaming something out there, some person you were in some supposed past life. But they're not willing to look at the present moment to see what they can do now, this very second, to change. And that's their problem. They would rather blame some God or the government or the corporations or some past life than to accept that they can change now, here and now. Because all change occurs in the now, not in the future, not in the past, not next life, next month, next year, in 10 years, in 20 years, now, this very second. You can become enlightened this very second, and I'm not talking about theory, I'm not repeating what other people have said. It is possible to become enlightened this very second if you're willing to learn the lessons your own spirit is teaching you. And if you're not, then don't worry. Your spirit has some more suffering waiting for you until you learn those lessons. But right now, I'd like to talk about another thing to do with suffering. This is based on my own spiritual experience. So you may choose to believe it or not. Certainly I found it very controversial when it first came to me, this realization. I'll share it with you and you can file it away for future use cases. And if you don't agree with it, feel free to reject it. I'm not your guru or anything. The realization is this. Many people say that the universe is without justice, then that there can be no God or being or spirit or whatever you want to call it, because there is so much suffering in the world. Little children die of starvation. There is widespread crime, malnutrition. Children are forced to become soldiers in a war, in many different wars. There's child abuse, murder, rape, drugs. So much unfairness in the world. And many people use this to prove that the universe doesn't make any sense, that there is no ultimate goal or anything. How would a God allow such injustice to occur say many people. And again, you can replace God with spirit or being. The idea is that the universe is random, that there is no justice, no sense, and that spirituality is just a load of nonsense, load of crock. Many people have these beliefs, not just atheists, but also many believers as well. They cannot accept how, if the universe is fair and made of love, can there be so much suffering in the world? And this is the realization I had, that the spirit exists, spirit or being or God, whatever you call it. Spirit exists not in spite of suffering. Let me rephrase that. The fact that spirit exists is not in spite of suffering, but because of suffering. This is hard to understand, so let me try to explain it. Suffering proves, all these things that I talked about: malnutrition, war, children dying, murder, rape, child abuse, people being forced into slavery, human slavery, even in the 21st century. All these things prove, all this suffering proves that something beyond our human world exists. Because, like I said, even in the most extreme of times, in the most extreme suffering, we can all go inside and feel the spirit within. And because of this, none of us really suffer, because the spirit, the God within us, is just a breath away. And even those people who do not yet realize this, even they are not beyond the reach of being. Whether at death or otherwise, at one stage they do realize this truth, that in spite of all their suffering, they are but one breath away from touching their real self. Like I said, this was a realization, so it's hard to explain to the logical mind. That suffering proves that spirit or being exists. It might be a slightly controversial statement, but it's my experience. That no matter how much suffering there is, each one of us can at any time go inside and touch the being within. And that is the whole purpose of this world. The world as such is an illusion. Well, the world is an illusion. Our interpretation, the way we view it, is an illusion. And we can at any time choose to ignore this illusion and see the world as it is. That is an extension of our own consciousness, our own being, our own spirit. And the spirit cannot be harmed. Like the Gita says, it cannot be killed, it cannot be burned, it cannot be cut. It is immortal and perfect beyond all measure. And that's why suffering is, at the end of the day, just an illusion. It is not real. It seems real while we are stuck in the mind. And I don't want to be some faraway guru. I suffer as well. I feel pain as well. But I also realize at one level that the pain, that is suffering, is not the ultimate reality. And that all of us, one day or the other, will become one with the true reality and see the world for what it is, an extension of our own self, our real self, our inner self. Call it the inner God. The world is an extension of our inner self. The trees, the leaves, the sky, it is all us. And that's why suffering cannot exist. And that's why it is very easy for us. Well, I say easy, it's not easy, but it is possible in just one breath to go from a world of illusion to a world of joy and peace, provided we can touch the being inside us. Most of us can't, and that's why we suffer. But this being, this spirit, is very close to us, and it is constantly reminding us that suffering, that all our pains, they are just an illusion. And all we need to do is look at the world with our deeper inner eyes and realize that there is nothing real in the outer world, that everything real exists inside of us, and the outer world is also an extension of us. This is a very hard truth to realize. Some of you are shaking your head, saying, "Oh yes, I agree. Trust me, you're mistaken." Intellectual agreement is not the same as understanding. Understanding comes from the heart, from within a deep part of us. Until you're up on that cross like Christ was, being tortured, until you are at that stage and you can still say, all this is an illusion. Until then, you are not realized. But that's okay. Your spirit, your own self will take you there. You don't need an outer guru or some silly fellow in an orange dress to teach you the truth. The truth is already inside you. So I'd like to conclude my lesson on suffering with these two lessons. First, suffering is important because it helps us go beyond the ego. And in some ways, it is the only way our ego will ever give up its control over the mind. And second, this is a deeper realization that you must realize for yourself and not just intellectually understand. The second realization is that all this suffering in this world, in our minds, for us, for others, is ultimately an illusion, because the outer world isn't real. When I say it's not real, I mean the way that we view it is not real. We view it as something outside of us, like this is me and this is that tree, this is me and this is that car, this is me and this is my wife, this is me and this is my child, this is me and this is the other world. And this is what is an illusion, that we see others as separate from us. And once we realize, and I do mean realize, not intellectually understand, the oneness of all, suffering will automatically vanish. Because to suffer, you need two people. You need you and me. And if it is all me, there can be no pain. How does one realize one's unity with being, with spirit? The answer is simple. One breath at a time. Take a deep breath. Let it go. Take a deep breath. Let it go. Take a deep breath. Let it go. And that's how you realize your oneness with being, one breath at a time. There is no secret, no shortcut. I wish there was. But that's how life is, one breath at a time. And I'll see you in the next session. Thank you for listening.